should get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
I want to start this video off by asking you guys a question I've polled you guys for many times over the years, and that question is, when do you think the beginning of something actually is? Do you think it's the first ever instance of that thing, or do you think the beginning of something is when that thing starts, continues, grows, and expands to thrive for years to come? That's what today's video is all about. The beginning of graffiti. Now, before we delve any deeper, we gotta get on the same page as far as what graffiti it is we're talking about, because many people will go ahead and be like, oh, well, you know, cave drawings and hieroglyphics, which, yes, that technically is graffiti. If we were talking about hieroglyphics, we wouldn't be having this conversation because, well, hieroglyphics would be, and cave drawings would be the genesis of graffiti. So we're gonna ignore that and continue on. The first instance of graffiti is just as relevant and just as important as when graffiti happened and continued, but these are two different origin stories. If you're trying to look at the first ever instance of something, many people refer back to Cornbread being the world's first graffiti artist, starting way back in 1967. Wait, didn't Taki start 1967? Hold up, 1965, correction. Started 1960, wait, that's also not right. How is that possible? He was in jail in 1965. Cornbread could not have started doing graffiti in 1965 because he himself says that his first ever graffiti tag was with the name Cornbread that he got while in jail. Not to mention his first tag was taken after he was released from jail in 1967. So he didn't start in 1965. His own words, not mine. Now, I want to give him benefit of doubt here just because I'll be honest, I forget my own age sometimes, and I just was asked my birthday today and almost forgot my birthday. So I'm gonna cut the man some slack on there, make of that information what you will. But even if we cut him slack on that and say he started in 1960, Cornbread is still predated. Where, you ask? Well, none other than New York. Once again, in 1950s, we had Bird Lives, graffiti all over the place, along with some other tags as well. And in 1940s, we also had more graffiti at that point. Cornbread himself admits as much in his interview where he goes ahead and says that gang members were already doing graffiti.
The only graffiti that you're seeing was gang names.
Meaning, he's already not the world's first graffiti artist. Now, many graffiti artists are of the belief that gang graffiti is in a little bit of a different category. It's not exactly the same thing that we do, while some other graffiti artists are not of that same thought. But let's just say you don't believe gang graffiti to be graffiti. Alright, fair enough. I will 100% accept that, because his story still gets predated by New York once again. That being graffiti happening in the 50s and the 40s. But as if that wasn't enough, all of these stories share one thing in common. That being graffiti started, continued, and then died off. And this all shares a massive parallel with ancient Rome. Now, I'm not talking about Pompeii here, but in ancient Rome, it was very common for art to be reserved for the higher class. The lower class couldn't really afford it as much, so they were frustrated, angry, and a little bit pissed off, understandably so they grabbed rocks, chisels, and whatever paint they can scrounge together, made up fake names, and wrote them on walls. Illegally, I might add. Going as far as to cross one another out for territory. The upper class hated this. They despised this, as it wasn't real fine art. So what did they do? They expunged it as best they could from history as much as they possibly can. They made sure they went out of their way to not document it. While there is still some documentation of it, there's not as much as there could have been. Once again, very similar to every instance of graffiti that happened before. Just like the graffiti that happened in 1800s in Egypt. And once again, we're not talking about hieroglyphics here. All of these share the same story as Cornbread's. Graffiti begins and it doesn't inspire. It doesn't spread. It doesn't manifest around the world. That didn't happen until New York came around. At that point, 1967, Taki 183, and a bunch of other graffiti artists began doing graffiti. It was here that graffiti began to cultivate a community. It began to come up with rules. It began to come up with a culture that it would then follow and establish itself as and become recognized for in the future. So if you're of the mind that Cornbread is the origin of graffiti because he's the first ever to do it, then you have to look at any of the examples that predate him and ended the same exact way Cornbread did, not inspiring and spreading graffiti. Up until this point, the world had no idea who Cornbread was. There's still example after example after example of graffiti predating Cornbread for decades and centuries. But dudes, that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed today's video, if you learned something, feel free to hit the like button. It goes a long way to help the channel out. And subscribe for more graffiti content. We got the best how to do graffiti tutorials right up here and more graffiti stuff down here on the bottom. I'll catch you guys next week. Thanks for watching.